Hi, I'm Dr. Paul Louis Metzger, and I'm the director of New Wine, New Wineskins. Welcome to New Wine Tastings, where every week we'll have an opportunity to engage people from diverse backgrounds, all in the attempt to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture. We are desirous of the opportunity to engage in deep and meaningful ways, and we're really thrilled and excited to have you with us.
Hello, I'm Paul Louis Metzger, the director of the Institute for Cultural Engagement, New Wine, New Wineskins, and it's my privilege to introduce to you Dr. Robert Potter. Dr. Robert Potter is someone who has been an advisor to me and a mentor to me in terms of medicine, science, and faith, serving as an advisor to us at New Wine, New Wineskins and Multnomah Seminary for our American Association for the Advancement of Science grant, Science for Seminaries. And his professional life has combined medical practice, teaching, and bioethics consultation. He has practiced internal medicine and geriatrics for 30 years while teaching in a community hospital affiliated with the University of Kansas School of Medicine. He is board certified in internal medicine and geriatrics and was elected as fellow of the American College of Physicians. In addition to his MD, Dr. Potter also holds a PhD in religion, psychology, and ethics from the University of Chicago Divinity School. From 1994 to his retirement in 2004, he was the bioethics scholar, instructor, and consultant for the Center for Practical Bioethics in Kansas City, Missouri. From 2004 to 2014, he was senior scholar for the Center for Ethics in Healthcare at Oregon Health and Science University. And I share all that because Dr. Potter is someone who brings a lot of different areas of scholarship and expertise to bear on the subject we're dealing with today, which is the coronavirus and holistic healthcare. We're titling this Holistic Health, Building Resilience in Troubled Times. Dr. Potter, thanks for joining us here at New Wine Tastings, where we seek to build relational bridges through Jesus in contemporary culture, including bridges between faith and science. So thank you for joining us.
I'm very happy to be here, Paul.
Robert, we certainly live in troubled times. How troubled? Well, that's the question. Please share with us, our viewers and listeners, about the impact of the coronavirus from a medical standpoint. Also, I'd like to know what your thoughts are about those who believe, or not about the persons themselves, but this position that the coronavirus is no more deadly than the common flu. Your thoughts?
Yes. Well, just looking at viruses generally, Paul, they are a fascinating element in life itself. A virus is a strand of RNA relative to DNA. We are made up of DNA and RNA. Those are the basic proteins of life. And a virus is just a bit of RNA, which is ribonucleic acid in fancy terms, and it's made up of the same 4 nuclear acids that our human genome is made of. This is the basic element of life itself. And the virus, the various viruses, find the capacity to invade the cells of their hosts. Viruses generally live in plants and animals, including humans, and they get their substance for living from the energy of that host in which they are living. So when a virus comes into our body, that virus, that little strand of protein, invades into the cell, mixes with the other ribonucleic acid elements of our body, and competes with them for the food substance and the energy that's being created inside that cell. Because of its capacity to compete with our own life sources, that life source, called a virus, will use up all of the nourishment of our cell, and that cell will dissolve, break into shreds. When that material floats around in our bloodstream, it's picked up by the temperature sensitive centers in our brain, and we get what we call a fever. Our temperature rises, and that's due to the cellular trash, we like to call it, that is a result of the breakdown of the cells that the viruses have invaded and used up all the energy substance of that cell. Now, the coronaviruses are a whole family of viruses that tend to invade, very successfully invade, the lining of our respiratory tract. So when we inhale a fragment of this virus that's in the droplets of air that people exhale or cough out, and it goes into our lungs, that virus seeks to invade a cell lining our respiratory tract, the bronchial tubes of our respiratory tract. And once it gets inside the cell, it starts replicating itself over and over and over again, uses up the cell substance, and causes that cell to break apart and shred, and that creates an inflammatory change in the lining of the respiratory tract. That's why the primary symptoms of this particular coronavirus are fever and cough, because the lining of our respiratory tract has become irritated, it's now inflamed, and we're trying to cough out the mucus that accumulates there. Now, these viruses have an amazing capacity to mutate, and they're constantly mutating. Some mutations don't do them any good whatsoever. They mutate, they live a short while, they're not any more successful than any other form of the virus, and so they quit replicating. However, if a mutation occurs that is highly successful and allows the virus to be more aggressive in the way that it invades the body of the host, that one becomes then the current virus that moves through the body quickly, destroys a lot of cells, sheds a lot of its own virus material in the mucus materials that's coughed out and breathed out. That goes to the next person, that goes to the next person, the next person, and pretty soon we have a local area that is so infected with the virus person to person that if we were able to keep that virus contained within that set of persons, we would have no epidemic and we would have no pandemic. We would have a very local onset of infection that could be contained. However, we are connected in our global world, so interconnected that what happens in one piece of the world is soon going to happen in the rest of the world. And that's exactly what we've seen occur as the virus has been moved, transported by its host, you and me, from one place to another. I just saw a report recently that I thought was very interesting, that New York had its invasion, if you want to call it that, of the virus, not from China, but from Europe. That it went from China to Europe and Europe back to the United States. Now, the West Coast perhaps is going to be a little more from the Oriental area, but be that as it may, it's because of our global connectedness that we are having the pandemics that we've had. So we need to be prepared for the next one and the next one. Viruses of all kinds will continue to mutate, and when they mutate in a way that makes them more successful, more aggressive, more able to infect their human hosts, the more we will have infections around the world. So we need to find ways to do that. Now, unfortunately, and speaking here more from a sociological point of view, the only way to contain a virus is through totalitarian control of a population. The only way to control the virus is to shut off a segment of people that are infected, shut them off from relationships to other people. And the only way you're going to achieve that with certainty is through a totalitarian control of a population. And that's something that will be difficult for us to find a way to do with a balance, so that freedom and totalitarianism find their own particular niche of being appropriate for the situation. But I see that as one of the bigger struggles in the future, is to how to organize ourselves in societies that are able to, through strict containment, hold an infection to a small area rather than allowing it to move around the world. So the coronavirus is interesting in it's a piece of living material that has decided to live in us and is able to do that because of our interconnectedness. And all of these factors together are working to create what we have on our hands today, a pandemic in which, according to this morning's accounts, more than 16,000 people in the United States have died as a consequence of coronavirus infection. That, of course, is still a relatively small percent of the total, but it is it's a bad disease. It is the best we can estimate at this time. It is perhaps 2 to 5 times more deadly than the ordinary influenza. On the other hand, if you think back 100 years, when we had the great pandemic of 1918, the numbers of people who died worldwide were in the millions. I mean, we're talking about 60 million people worldwide. In those days, we didn't even have all the interconnectedness, but we were moving people around the world, if you recall, because World War I was in place. And we were moving soldiers from the United States to the European theater and then back and forth and crowding people together. And there were all kinds of ways in which the influenza virus of 100 years ago found its way around an interconnected community. And without all the capacity to help people through serious illness in those days, many more people died. There were no ventilators. If you'll recall, there were no ventilators. As a bit of historical information, when I was in training as an internal medicine specialist of 1965 through 1968, if I put somebody on a ventilator, I had to sit there and flip the switch 12 times a minute. We didn't have automatic respirators. I mean, it's only been in the last couple, 3 generations that we've had this capacity to help people through the worst of the coronavirus illness, that is the failure of the respiratory tract of the lungs to support us. So this is a bad disease. It's not just like an ordinary influenza. It has mutated. It's a more aggressive virus. It can do more damage to more people, and we have to be very careful to combat it. Now, I would like to say that our experience out here in Oregon, particularly here in the Portland area, has been such that we have not had the great terror that other communities are experiencing. I think we should feel ourselves blessed to have avoided the rapid transmission from person to person. Certainly, if you look at specific problems within a nursing home or a certain cluster of people, the transmission is going rapidly among those people. That's to be expected. That is the way the virus operates. But if we can isolate one another, keep people from congregating together, this will reduce the transmission of the virus from one person to another. My wife and I are in isolation, although we have been out. We've been to the grocery store once with a mask on. We've visited friends, but only one set of friends where we had spent any time with them. We have 2 young families. Both of them are in isolation, and we have not gone into their homes with feeling that we don't want to give any kind of risk to the young children that are involved there. Even though there's this talk, that young children don't get sick. They get sick and some die. So that's it's not at the high rate that we older people are going to succumb. But that's a quick rundown of the virus. It is a consequence of the way we're organized in the world and the way that viruses tend to mutate and find their own way to succeed as viruses from host to host. It's a bad virus. It's worse than the average. Over time, it'll settle down. It'll mutate again, and perhaps mutate in a way that's not as aggressive, or find a way to mutate that makes it even more aggressive. We have to wait and see how those mutations occur.
So thank you, Robert, for giving us the better grasp of what the coronavirus is, the family, the network within the coronavirus, how it tends to mutate so rapidly and so aggressively, and also how it is of much greater concern than the common flu. I wonder, having discussed briefly the sociological dimension, and this is going to take us forward as we talk about medicine and psychology, because those are both areas of your expertise. I wonder, with the sociology dynamic, if in part some of why a portion of our population, just trying to understand, will write it off as just equivalent to the common flu. I wonder if part of that write-off may be due, I don't ultimately know, but may be due to concerns over totalitarianism, that the limitation of freedom, because all of us are wired such that we have biases. I have biases. We all have biases that cause us to reflect upon data differently. As you and I are individuals who really like Jonathan Haidt's work with moral foundations and such, and autonomy, freedom, equity, different kinds, and maybe also then there's the matter of what we trust, authority, and maybe some don't trust what the scientific community might say. I mean, it could be a combination of factors. I don't know if you wish to speak to that, because I think that is such a fascinating point you raise about totalitarianism and how are we going to navigate both our concern as Americans and people more broadly for freedom, but also you have to lock down this virus, keep it contained so it doesn't spread and mutates, so rapidly, regionally, nationally, internationally. But just if you could speak to that issue of how that might shape our biases about freedom, totalitarianism, trust. What sources of authority do we trust? Faith, science, etc. Could you speak to that just briefly, please?
Yes, indeed. In fact, over the past week, on a weekly basis, I produce a little, what I call a post rather than a blog, and I write out perhaps 3 pages of commentary over a certain portion of the scripture. And right now I'm working through Galatians. And in the Galatians letter, Paul is inviting us into freedom. Then he says, well, once you're free, you don't use your freedom for self-indulgence. What do? You use it for radical obedience to another law, the law of Christ, which is the law to bear one another's burdens. This pandemic is a exercise in seeing to what extent we can bear one another's burdens. Can we set aside our own desire to be free and do whatever we want to, and put ourselves into social isolation, and to move about more carefully, to move about only with gloves on or with masks on or only to certain places? This is a test to what extent can we lay aside our individualistic idea of freedom, which is to do whatever we jolly well please, or as Paul suggests, moving towards self-indulgence, and instead do what is good for all of us together. To me, the pandemic is a test of the moral possibilities of the human being. If the human being is able to set aside the most precious parts of our freedom, which is a freedom to enjoy our self-interest, to bring about a freedom of another kind of freedom, the freedom to join in with one another and lay aside what we privately want for freedom for the sake of one another, and therefore fulfill the law of Christ. I think this is an exercise in moral testing. And how we come out of this and how we then prepare for the next pandemic, which surely will come. It will come sooner or later, who knows when, but it will come. And we will once again have to set aside our individual freedoms for the freedom of acting on behalf of everyone, and thus fulfilling the law of Christ that we bear one another's burdens. I think this needs to be thought of as a moral exercise.
Thank you, Robert. As we move forward in our discussion, what are symptoms of the coronavirus, and what should be done as one experiences those symptoms? We see a lot of it, discussions of this on the news, but I wanted to ask you, as a practitioner, someone with a long history of observing and providing recommendations and care for patients.
Well, so often people have called the flu anything that causes me to feel bad. Whether I've got the sniffles or a little upset stomach or maybe a little diarrhea, that's all called the flu. Well, that's not the case. Influenza is a specific lower respiratory infection, not an upper respiratory infection. Upper respiratory infections involve the nasal cavities, the sinus cavities, the throat. That's upper. That's not coronavirus and influenza and viruses in general. They are involve infection only of the bronchial tubes. So your first genuine symptom of coronavirus is going to be fatigue and just not feeling well. That's too general to make much of. Fever will be next, and that's a little too general to make much of. It's when the cough occurs. That's when you need to think, perhaps coronavirus. And that's the stage at which testing, if were it widely available, would be important to determine whether or not you need to go into absolute immediate isolation from all possible contacts. If we had the capacity to measure the presence of the coronavirus in the body, that is, do this testing that's being done at various levels now, if we had the capacity to take somebody who's had fever and a cough, test them, find out whether it's the coronavirus, and then isolate them, say in a hotel room all by themselves for 14 days, that would be the most significant way to reduce the travel of the coronavirus from person to person. But once again, back to the symptoms now, more carefully. It is fatigue, fever, and cough, pretty much in that order. I feel bad. Oh, I feel hot. Oh, I'm coughing. And then you may have the coronavirus or some form of a lower respiratory infection. And there are lots of others. There's the ordinary influenza. It still keeps, traveling around. Many of us have found our immunity to the other kinds of influenzas through experience of them in the past, so that our body has antibodies built up to combat that particular form of the viruses. Or we've had an injection, an immunization that has given us, our body, a chance to develop these immune bodies that will fight the virus as soon as it comes into the body. We don't have that protection when it comes to the coronavirus of this particular type. And you got to have antibodies to this particular type in order to have the defense and the resistance to this particular type. That's why we're thinking in terms of a vaccine to be developed in time, so that once that becomes a possibility, the most of us will get that immunization along with all kinds of other immunizations, and we will have an immunity capacity to keep the virus from invading our cells. So those antibodies that are floating around in our bloodstream all the time will sense the presence of this coronavirus 19, and those antibodies will cluster around that virus, control it, keep it from invading the cell, and keep us from becoming sick. That's the magic of an immunization, which we'll be looking forward to sometime in the future. And it'll just be mixed in with all the other shots, and you go to your pharmacy, your doctor, or someplace and get the shot, and we will have a relatively adequate method of controlling this particular virus. It will do us no good for the next mutation. That's why we have to be constantly vigilant and watching out for mutations and identifying them rapidly, which is part of the science of virology nowadays. It is to take specimens of infected tissue from a person who is ill, and within a very short period of time, I grow and identify the virus down to its genetic specialty. See, the virus has a genome just like we humans have a genome. And if we can write that genome out, that's why we get the 19 on this whole thing, coronavirus 19. I don't know what the 19 means, but it has something to do with the genome. You know, at the point 19 along the genome, there's perhaps this is where the mutation has occurred. I don't know. I don't know enough virology to be up on that, but I bet that's what the 19 is all about. That's at the 19 point along its genome that a variation has occurred, which has made it a more aggressive kind of an illness.
So, you had mentioned, Robert, that we have to remain vigilant. Pandemics, epidemics, they come and go, and in due course, there will be another one. We hear talk about there could be a reawakening, a reemergence in the autumn. The point, I think, in all this is that we shouldn't lessen our resolve or let down our guard. And I think as we move toward discussions of psychology and with that sociology and then spirituality in this interview today, I think it's very important that we don't think, well, this is a passé subject. It's not. Are we going to learn what you said earlier? Are we going to learn how as humans, how as the Christian community, more broadly, how as humans we can lay down our own rights for the sake of others, for the sake of the whole? And that's going to be a challenge. Freedom is important, individual freedom. But Paul says, use your freedom to serve as you have been drawn to Christ, as you have been led to Christ. May Christ continue to lead you, to lead us. And so I think that's an important point, because some will claim that this is a passing phenomenon. And while this strand may pass, this gives us an opportunity, not just an obstacle. And we grieve over those who suffer and who've died. I mean, it's so heavy. I mean, to say the least, it's so heavy. It also gives us an opportunity. It's not just an obstacle to life. It's also an opportunity for greater resilience, greater resolve. And we dare not lose out on the opportunity to learn through this, of how to collaborate more, even if that means practicing social distancing. Part of love at this point, which is counterintuitive to some, entails social distancing. For the sake of relational connection, sometimes we have to practice social distancing. And so I think as we proceed with this conversation and moving forward into the future, this is not a passé phenomenon. We need to think through what we can learn now for the sake of later. So with that in mind, your areas of expertise, as I had alluded to earlier, bridge the medical and psychological domains. Later, we're going to talk more about spirituality and your work in that context, but you're concerned for medical as well as psychological well-being. Those are not separate entities. It's not the ghost in the machine. It's not a Cartesian dualism orientation. These areas of our identity are vitally connected. How does one guard against the pandemonium or the pandemic, the pandemonium or the panic in the face of this pandemic?
That's clever. The pandemonium of pandemic. I like, you ought to put that in print, Paul.
Well,
the pandemonium of pandemic. Oh, I can see it now. The Paul Metzger motto.
Yeah, that's right. Well, a lot of people think I'm the pandemic and also the cause for panic. But what might our viewers learn or listeners do to cultivate the mind as well as the body as they cope with the coronavirus threat?
When I think about that, Paul, I try to come back to a way of understanding what is it that makes me who I am. And I want to claim that I am who I am because of the network of relationships in which I exist. I exist in a relationship to myself, to others, to the created world, and through all of that, I relate to God. My relationships are what make me who I am. The threat of a crisis like this, with its isolation, is a threat to our relationships. And that's why I think it is primarily important during this time to find ways to keep our relationships intact. And so, with the amazing capacity of the electronic communication, it is so new to me. Every now and then, I look at the coal oil lamp that sits on a shelf in my bedroom. I studied by that coal oil lamp in the 3rd grade in central Illinois. I was 9 years old before electricity came to central Illinois. And I have lived through a period of time in which telephone lines are no longer mounted on the fence posts, are no longer a party line. We are in a era of communication that should allow us to maintain the essence of our relationships. Even if we cannot hug, if we cannot kiss, if we cannot be close together, we can continue to preserve our relationships through the multiple ways that we have to intercommunicate. I think that that is the one thing that needs to be constantly on the minds of people who are saying, what shall I do to keep falling into a panic of fear, of the anxiety that seems to overtake me? Because here's the way it is. When your relationships are cracked, are broken open, you feel alone. To feel alone, immediately you feel helpless. And it's the moment you feel helpless, you move right on to hopeless. And that is the condition of the human being when they realize that the relationships that make them who they are distorted, are threatened. That is the essence of the problem we face now, that our relationships are threatened. I think back always to that marvelous 3-word conjunction that the Apostle Paul gave us of faith, hope, and love. For me, faith is trusting those relationships that make me who I am. Hope is the expectation that those relationships will continue into the future and continue to be there to give me a sense of meaning of who I am. And love is the realization that those relationships are still there and holding me solidly in the presence of God. Faith, hope, and love, to me, ought to be expanded into a way to talk about how we can trust and expect and realize the relationships that make us who we are. And it's through those relationships that we are related to God, and it's through those relationships that God relates to us. The network of relationships in which we exist is absolutely crucial. And that, to me, is the core of what needs to go on in the psychological life in order to guard against falling into the sense of despair, that the meaning of life is gone, the hope of life is gone. So what I have been thinking about for myself and for my wife and me, and I communicate to my kids and to any of those within our church congregation that I communicate with on a regular basis, the number one thing to help keep our psychic stress response under control is the old-fashioned notion that we need to get plenty of sleep and have exercise. But in addition to that, I think there's some other specific things that address the mind. Meditation, which was called originally in the medical world, the relaxation response when it was first introduced back in the 70s. The relaxation response is a period of time. I practice this as many times a day as I feel the need. It's 10 minutes to sit quietly, to calm the mind, focusing on one thing. Often I just listen to my breath as I breathe in and out, breathing a little extra deeply and a little more rhythmically, breathing in and out, and just quieting the body. Quieting the body in this way is actually a, a, um, a medicine to keep our psychic balance in place, to find ways to just calm it all down. The other things that I find is to talk about old happy times. My wife and I get out our old scrapbooks. We get out the old DVD that we did for our 50th wedding anniversary. You know, we rehearse the great moments that were the loving statement of the relationships that held us into being. We rehearsed those things. We 7 or 8 years ago produced a little 1-hour comedy routine involving several members of our congregation called the rummage sale. And, you know, we play that over again and we laugh and laugh and laugh once more as the audience is thrilled by the little jokes that we pulled on one another. You know, it's looking back over things that we've accomplished in the past. In addition to that, we lay out every day things we're going to accomplish today. It's clean the garage, you know, do a little work outside. It's clean up the area behind our television in the corner where we put everything, you know. I mean, even the 2 urns that are supposed to hold our interred ashes are back there. We need to let people know what's behind our television. So we're going to have to make a little, you know, make a list of things there and pass it around to our children. But in addition to that, the general thing about keeping the psyche together is to keep rehearsing the familiar. Remembering that these things which have held us together continue to hold us together, to rehearse the familiar relationships, to call people, to email people that we've known and loved around the years. All of those things for me are part of maintaining that psychological balance that is so necessary in times of crisis. Once again, to summarize that kind of blabbering on and on from an old professor, you know, what I'm talking about here is this. The relationships that make you who you are at threat in any crisis. Reducing the threat by rehearsing the familiar, keeping those relationships intact through social media is the primary method of keeping our resilience, our capacity to resist falling into the sense of despair.
Thank you, Robert. I really appreciate that. You know, my mother passed away just before the outbreak, and we were able to get back to Illinois, where I'm from, for the memorial service. So we're grateful. I grieve for those who have not been able to be with their loved ones as they pass, or even to hold memorials presently in this situation. But, you know, just thinking back on my parents' lives, my mom was born after World War I. She was born in the 1920s. She died at 93. But my parents had gone through the Great Depression. They had gone through World War II and so much else. And they were resilient. And I think even just looking back at their lives, reflecting on their lives, and then things that we've come through as a family, and we're still happening. We're still moving forward. I hear in what you're saying to remind ourselves to go back, to reflect, to familiarize ourselves once again with the familiar, the patterns of life, those relationships of the past as well as the present. For elderly people where, you know, when my mom would talk about some of her friends who would pass, and she was one of the last ones left, how hard that was for her, but she would remember. She would remember. And of course, she had connection with her family and others. But remembrance is such a key theme. And I think when we look at scripture, and we're in Holy Week presently, to remember, do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me, the Lord said. And he was using familiar objects for the disciples at a time of great trauma. He's saying, I'm going away, but I will come back. And, they don't quite comprehend any of what he's saying right then and there. But
frankly speaking, the relationships that they had with Jesus, they could sense was being threatened.
Absolutely.
Yeah, being threat to the relationships is what's going on there.
And it's just amazing, his own resilience. We could say, well, he was God. Well, he was human too, and it's so on and so forth. But he certainly drew on his relationship with the Father. That's a big theme in the Gospels. He also, drew on the history of Israel. He was, once again, this familiar Passover celebration. They were going through Passover, but remember how God has brought you forth. Remember, and he's going to lead them into the new Exodus, the promised land. That's the narrative. But he familiarizes them and refamiliarizes them with the familiar, and everything's under threat. But he doesn't abandon them, and he encourages them not to abandon one another. And I think in this time, like you said, with the social distancing that is required, we can make use of technology to stay connected, and doing the little things, the gardening, doing the little things like cleaning up, doing the little things, our normal practices, and the meditation is so key. Now, as we transition, there's a sense in which we don't need to transition. You've been talking about faith throughout this, and that's one of the things I just so admire about you. You're a medical doctor, you have a background in psychology and social psychology, and you're a person of deep and abiding faith, a churchman, someone who really takes seriously the discourse involving faith and science in a way that is not about conflict. While there can be conflict at times, it's much more of a synergy and a symphony. And you are a person of deep and abiding faith. It's obvious from even what you've shared so far today. How does your Christian faith bear in how you engage individuals medically and psychologically, both in your career as a medical doctor and as an ethicist in the medical domain? And how might other people's faith bear on helping us cultivate resilience to battle this pandemic?
Well, Paul, when you point to my experience as a physician, I immediately think that it's once again a matter of relationships. I went into medicine with a sense that I was going to be entering a field in which I would be daily tested as to whether I could maintain, some of the time, most of the time, as much of the time as possible, a sense of what Jesus taught us, to have compassion for one another, love for one another. I found myself being fascinated by language as a sophomore in high school when I was tricked into taking a Latin course. And I realized that language is a symbolic system that we use to create meaning out of all of our experiences of life. So I go back to Latin so often. The word compassion, the prefix com, C-O-M, means with. The word passion means to suffer. To have compassion is the ability to suffer with another person. When I think of suffering with another person, I think of that as the burden of practicing medicine, the burden of following the law of Christ, but at the same time, the blessing of having the capacity of compassion. To suffer with others is what causes us to understand that our relationships are the critical piece to all that we find meaningful in our existence. And to have the capacity to suffer with another is absolutely central to the Christian life. And so I learned that in medicine. There were times I failed to be compassionate. And when I recognized that, I was forced with humility to my knees to realize that human that I am, my capacity for compassion had its limits. Nevertheless, I think about compassion in this time of great suffering. When I'm not suffering, I'm suffering this minimal inconvenience of being isolated. To be isolated with my wife is no big suffering, We get along pretty well. We've been doing it for 60 years. I've been in love with her since the fourth grade, I'm not going to give up on that. So this is no big burden. I'm not suffering. But when I see others suffering, when I see people losing their livelihood, when I see the economic crisis coming down on so many people, I have that sense of empathy, the other word, that is similar to compassion. All empathy is constructed out of a couple of Greek words, and compassion comes from the Latin, but they both mean the same thing, the capacity to experience what another person is experiencing. And I think that those are right at the center of what the Christian life is about. As a part of our way of managing our isolation from one another in our church congregation, our pastoral leadership has suggested that we all develop a worship center in our home. So on a little coffee table in our living room, we have a cross, and it's a crucifix cross. Being an old Protestant, the crucifix is not one of my favorites, but it's my favorite during the season of Lent, to be reminded that what we're dealing with is suffering. So we have the crucifix, and we have a candle or two, and we have some stones, and we have some other little symbols that we work around. And each evening, we come to that space. We read some scripture, another little section of the story of Holy Week, and we reflect, and we find ourselves invariably, as we look upon the suffering of Christ on the cross, we invariably think about all of those who are suffering today from this pandemic, suffering at illness, suffering being on the ventilator, suffering death, suffering the grieving of one who has died and they can't be with them, suffering the loss of their business, suffering the inability to pay for food, the inability to get out and get anything. All of the suffering that's going on comes crashing down on us. And we realize that the only way to bear up the burdens of one another is take upon ourselves the new being that's granted to us in Jesus Christ, that we can find a way to bear the burdens of others without being crushed by that burden. So we work towards a little bit of worship each day that helps connect us in our relationship with the suffering Christ, and to realize that it is through this suffering that new life comes out on the other end. So I guess you would want to say that this is sort of practicing empathy, practicing compassion, but doing it seriously so that we don't just say, oh my goodness, isn't that too bad? We find ways to exercise it too. We have some people for whom we have picked up some groceries and delivered it to their home. One woman in particular, who was our neighbor for 16 years and lost her home, could not pay for her mortgage any longer, and is now living in a low rent apartment, has very few means of support. And so we would, in active compassion, bear a bit of the burden with her, or to call somebody and to encourage them, or to send out a little joke to somebody to give them a sense of possibility for the day. All of those are exercises of compassion that we try each day to make part of our life. It's a way of practicing compassion.
Robert, as you were sharing about that, I was thinking of a point that Michael Sandel, professor at Harvard, public philosophy, has said about, for many people in our society, and he's not alone in talking about this, but for many people in society, compassion is like a, I don't want to call it an endangered species, but like a rare commodity, a rare treasure, and you have to preserve it in order to maintain its value. But he says it's more like a muscle, that the more you exercise it, the more it grows. And I think, if we're to learn anything from this pandemic, we really need to exercise that compassion muscle, because in the midst of the social distancing and the lockdown, so to speak, we need to make sure we're looking creatively for ways to connect with people, to have that empathy, that compassion, as you were talking about, to step inside people's shoes and lives and to find practical ways of doing so. That's something that I think for a lot of people, resilience is more like an individual thing. It's like, okay, how do I practice resilience? How do I cultivate resilience? Just, me, myself, for myself. And what you've said the whole time is it's a relational orientation. It's moving outside of ourselves. And, Paul says, when one grieves, the whole grieves. When one rejoices, the whole rejoice. And I think of the suffering church around the world, other people suffering from their faith, for their faith convictions, people in China, people in Africa, people suffering in different contexts. It's so easy for us to shut ourselves down from other people's suffering and just focus on our own. But what I hear you saying is, even for those who are focused primarily on their own resilience, if you really want to grow toward having resilience even unto yourself, what I hear you saying between the lines is the best way to do that is to develop empathy and compassion toward all people, and to exercise that compassion muscle. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, absolutely, Paul. That's so well said. In a post that I put out this week, I went back to an old song that my wife and I sang in 1972. We were part of a group out of Chicago that was dedicated to the notion of reviving the church and its capacity to encounter the world, much as you do through New Wine Skins and New Wine and New Wineskins. So the song was sung to the tune of "When You Are Aware," when you're in love. When you are aware, the whole world is a mountain of care. Skies constantly weep over all of the tragedy there. Then your heart starts to soar with the knowledge that comes to, and I've forgotten the rest of the verse, but to imagine that when you are aware, the whole world is a mountain of care. And you and I in Christ are invited to participate by picking up that burden of care. And that's why I think this pandemic, for me and for our society, ought to be an exercise in moral capacity, the capacity to suffer with, to bear the burdens with others, and to do that in a way that does not destroy ourselves, and to find the balance between loving ourselves and loving others. If you recall, now I know you recall that the second commandment that Jesus pointed to when asked by the lawyer, what are the greatest commandments? And he said, love the Lord your God. Then the second is like it to the first. Love others as you love yourself. There has to be a balance between loving others and loving yourself. If you don't have a reserve for yourself, you're not enough of a self to be loving others. There has to be a balance. I learned that as a physician, that I could give and give and give, but I had also to be getting something from that. And what we know, of course, is that when we give compassion, it is given back to us. And we are reinforced by the compassion that we gave, reinforced constantly. My office mate, after I retired from business, medical business, and was doing ethics primarily, she began to be a hospice physician. And she was asked over and over again, how do you work with dying people? How do you keep from being so drawn down by yourself? And she says, to care for the dying is life-giving itself. And so I want to testify to the notion that giving compassion gives back to you. You have to find a balance there. You have to be sure that what you're doing is not sacrificing all of your self reserves, all the resources that you have to keep yourself intact. You have to keep intact, and that means keep your relationships intact. If you can do that, then your capacity for compassion, your capacity to share in the burdens of others is, I don't want to say limitless, but it is expanded so much. The old theologian Jonathan Edwards from the 1700s talked about the constricted heart, and that learning the Christian way was to have your heart expanded so that the heart can bear the burdens of others. It is so much a sense that in this time of pandemic, we are called in the Christian faith to understand that this is a time in which we can become more compassionate, exercise our compassion, and realize that it's through the exercise of our compassion that we preserve and enhance and strengthen the relationships in which we exist. And it's all of that together that will weave a supporting net that allows us to get through this crisis.
Thank you so much, Robert. That was powerful. And I love how you brought in Edwards at the end as well. So any closing thoughts for us, Dr. Robert Potter?
Well, it's only to repeat what I've said so far, and that is all crises of this type, the crises that cause us to isolate ourselves from one another, is a threat to the network of relationships that gives meaning to our existence. Look to the familiar, contact everyone you can contact. Remember that we, by maintaining relationships, move through and beyond that which threatens our relationships, that we all are related with one another and through one another related to God. And all of that together brings us to a confidence that we will survive.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's just always a blessing to interact with you and learn from you. It's gone back several years now, and I cherish our friendship and our partnership. And so, Dr. Robert Potter, thank you for joining us at New Wine Tastings. This is Paul Louis Metzger, and thank you for joining us once again, this time as we're dealing with holistic care in terms of fighting the pandemic, not panicking, but building holistic strategies for building resilience in this context of the coronavirus. So thank you, Robert, and thanks all for watching and listening.